Hello, students. This week we are in week 3. We're for COM 505, and we're focusing on the message and the medium and how it relates to communication theory. Our weekly agenda tells us we're reading chapters 4 and 5 of the course text. We're actually spending some time looking at 6 different theories. I know that's a lot. You'll see that a lot of them have some similarities and they're all blended together and looking at how we look at media, and particularly the message and the medium in that sense. I'm not going to go through and provide a detailed explanation of all of them. I am going to try to give you an overview of at least half. But we are working on 2 different assignments this week as well. We are on discussion board number 3, which is due on Friday, with reply posts due no later than Sunday, as well as critical review number 2. Our weekly objectives tell us that at the completion of this week, we are discussing theories that relate to communication messages and mediums, as well as exploring semiotics, interpretation, communication mediums, and media effects and theory, as well as discussing how messages and communication mediums influence theory. This relates directly to objective 1.1 and 2.2 within our course syllabus, if you're wondering how that aligns. When we look at critical review number 2, I'm not going to give you an in-depth overview. If you're confused on what to do with these critical review assignments, I would ask you to please refer to the week 2 lecture, where I give you a really in-depth overview. I spend at least 3 or 4 minutes on what are the expectations of the critical review and what I'm looking at in general. This is the same exact assignment that we did in critical review number 1. This week, you're just selecting a new piece of research. So a new research study to look at and how it relates to major concepts of the theory you're going to look at and things like that. I would also look at what my feedback is for the first critical review and see how that applies to making improvements for this critical review and things like that. But if you want explicit instructions on how to complete the critical reviews, that is in the week lecture number 2. So go to the week 2 announcement in Blackboard and you'll find the lecture there, and you can review the explicit instructions and expectations on that. Discussion number 3 asks you to look at social constructionism. There are some scholars that argue social constructionism lends us to the constructivist approach of communication as being a third lens of how we communicate. Others disagree with that. However, in this discussion board, I would like you to tell me what social constructionism is, discuss how it relates to communication studies, provide your own scholarly opinion of it and the constructivist approach to communication, as well as share one communication research study that relates to social constructionism and provide a discussion about that and its relevance to communication. Once you've done that, you should have a good handle of what your ideas are of social constructionism and see its benefits to our discipline as a whole. In addition to that, we're going to spend some time looking at agenda setting theory. McCombs and Shaw found that there was a noted influence of news media on residents of North Carolina during the 1968 election, presidential election. They found that media can set public agenda and discourse by not telling you what to think, we're too savvy for that, but rather by telling us what to think about. They found that that media coverage was significantly influential in telling residents of North Carolina what to think about related to the 1968 election. It's one of the most prominent media effects theory. It's more sophisticated than hypodermal theory, where it tells us that you can inject messages into the minds of media consumers and they'll believe whatever you want to. That was debunked and found that we are way too savvy today to believe things like that. But rather, agenda setting theory is very, very noteworthy. It's one of the most prominent news media effects theories and looking at how news affects society, and is most recently being applied to social media and other forms of media. And in essence, it's going to tell us that public agenda and discourse is typically set by what is not only presented through media, but it gets us talking about it. And so in a sense, you'll see that news stations will use agenda setting theory to set agendas and trends and what's covered across multiple news outlets today, in addition to getting society talking about that. So you may see a trend in political news across social media, news outlets, and even within television shows and printed media that all get us talking about similar topics related to whatever that may be. That is agenda setting at its finest. It's not telling us what to think about related to those topics, but it's telling us what to think about. It's telling us what to talk about. You'll hear people say things, in passing about, hey, did you hear about such and such and such and such? Did you see this on the news? That is all related to agenda setting theory. So it's very, very, very influential in terms of being prominent and showing how news curators, or those that are creating the news, can be influential in getting and setting the discourse and agenda of what people are talking about within society. Cultivation theory, on the other hand, looks at heavy media consumption. It tells us that we are more susceptible to media messages and the belief that they are real and valid based off of how much and how frequently and how often we consume media. So Gribner and Gross found this to be in the 70s. It was related directly to television at the time, that people were believing everything they saw on television because they were heavily consuming it. And I watched it on Oprah, and I watched it on this channel, and I watched it on that channel, and Walter Cronkite told me that, so that means that it must be true. It was things related to that. There was a cultivation of attitudes also that were based on attitudes already present in society. Essentially, this mean world syndrome came out of this theory. The idea of the more violence you watch through media, the more you believe the world is dangerous. So when you turn on the news and all you see is today so-and-so was killed, today in a car accident somebody died, today somebody was shot in a gang shooting, if that's all that's covered on the news, then people were starting to believe that the world is actually more dangerous than it actually was. So they were starting to think, I'm not going to go outside. Everybody's dying every day, but that's not the reality. The reality is that's what they were covering on the news. And so that heavy media consumption led people to believe and think that the world was more dangerous than it actually was in reality. Viewers are typically unaware to the extent in which they absorb media. If you have the news on in the background, you may be thinking you're not absorbing it, but you're passively and tacitly consuming it. It's there. It's in the background. You can hear, you can listen, you can do this, and you can do that. So they found that television significantly influences our perception of the world. We're now using cultivation theory to look at different media outlets because we know today we consume media in multiple different ways than just watching it on television. And we're finding that it's still valid and it's still true. We consume media through streaming devices, our phones, or whatever it may be. It will still influence our perception of the world. The last point that they found that was really significant about this theory was that media consumption cultivates attitudes within its viewership, meaning consumers flock to like-minded media outlets to further cultivate their attitudes on those particular topics or those particular things they would prefer to consume. If they're really into sports, you're going to see them watching sports-related channels. If they're really into documentaries, you're going to see them watching channels that are related to documentaries. News, you're going to see them watching that related to news. If they typically prefer liberal news outlets, they're going to watch into liberal news outlets as opposed to conservative news outlets, vice versa. So as you look at that from that perspective and you think about it from that perspective, cultivation theories tells us we cultivate our attitudes based off of, yes, what's already in society, but more importantly, through what media we consume. That then leads us, I told you we have a lot, to uses and gratification theory. So uses and grats is what it's referred to in a more informal basis. But uses and gratification developed by Bloomer and Katz tells us that people use media for the gratification they get from it. So we found that it can cultivate ideas and attitudes. We found that it can set the agenda. And now we're finding that people will use media for the gratifying services that it can provide for them in whatever it may be. It looks at media consumption in a different perspective than what we've already looked at. It tells us that media users play an active role in choosing and using media. They take an active part in this communication process, and media usage is goal-oriented for the consumer. They tell us media users will seek out media sources that best fulfill the needs of the user because they want to be gratified through that media. So it is in line with what we just learned about cultivation theory, that we typically will consume media that is in line with the similar attitudes we have in life about whatever. For example, like I mentioned, somebody that is a sports fanatic will consume sports-related media. Same thing here. That sports fanatic in uses and grats theory is going to use sports outlets to gratify and satisfy his media needs related to sports. Media users seek out media sources that best fulfill their specific personal needs as a user. Media users always have an alternative choice to satisfy their media needs if that said media outlet changes its function and it's no longer gratifying to them. That's important to keep in mind. So I'm following somebody on Instagram and I go to them for comedic relief, and now their account went crazy political and I am no longer gratified and my needs are no longer satisfied through them. So I stopped following them, but that's okay because Instagram, through its algorithm, is going to show me someone else that's similar, that is going to be just as gratifying in my comedic relief that I need. That's an example of uses and gratification theory. It doesn't matter. I'll move on to the next from that perspective. There are many reasons for using and consuming media. This theory looks at the user playing an active role in media and using it as a purely transaction basis to satisfy needs. It's a satisfaction of needs from that perspective. So as we develop and we create content and curate media, we need to keep that in mind, that media users will utilize free will to decide how they will use and how media affects them. So keep that in mind. It's different. Instead of cultivating attitudes, instead of looking at how media sets the agenda, Uses and Grats looks at the user and tells us we will use media for whatever needs we need to use to satisfy whatever needs those may be. It's very, very important to keep that perspective, that user perspective. The last thing we're going to look at is coordinated management of meaning, which this theory actually is heavily rooted in interpersonal comm as well as cultural and communicative actions. It's actually a little bit of a stretch in looking at how it looks at media. It's really rooted in the cybernetic tradition, which conceptualizes communication as an information processing model. Specifically, scholars that are cybernetic in nature think about concepts such as system processing, information, messages, senders, receivers, and things related to that method in looking at communication. Barnett, Peirce, and Vernon Cronin developed this theory. It's sociocultural in nature, and it's really rooted in the conversation. It is looking directly at the consumer and the message and the medium that we're communicating, but we're getting less off of this media focus and more on the message that in the conversation that we're having. CMM is a comprehensive approach to social interaction. So we could look at this from a media perspective or not, but however, we are looking at it this week in many different ways. As a comprehensive approach to social interaction that addresses the ways in which complex meanings and actions are coordinated within communication. Particularly, this theory addresses all contexts of communication from micro interactions to cultural and societal processes. However, emphasis is given to the conversation. Peirce and Cronin believe that these interactions, and we construct our own realities within this, will happen naturally in everyday interactions. In fact, as we construct these social realities, we assign meaning to those interactions. So CMM describes a way that in any communication situation, a person does two things. One, that person will assign meaning to the situation, to be the behaviors and the messages. The second thing is that the person will decide how to respond or act within that situation. CMM helps us understand the process of assigning meaning and action during a communicative situation. Within this framework of the theory, we must coordinate our actions with those of others in the process of interaction. To do this, there are three sets of ideas within CMM: coordination, coherence, and mystery. Coordination is the way that we direct our attentions to the ways actions come together to produce patterns. Coherence is the way that we direct our attentions to the stories that make our life meaningful. We pay attention to the construction of meaning and things of that nature. And then the mystery is any social pattern that does not fit within it. It will affect how we assign in our meaning to those messages. So CMM really just tells us how we coordinate meanings and conversations within our own internal structure. It tells us how we add and use coordination in many different ways to do this, as well as providing coherence to that. And once we've assigned meaning to it, we can be an effective communicator. It's heavily influenced by culture. Those realities we've created are directly influenced in the way that we assign coordination and coherence to the story. So keep that in mind. I know I've hit you with a lot of theories. I know it's been a really truncated and abbreviated version of those. That's okay. You have videos to review related to that. It's in your book, so read about them and then watch this again, and it'll start to make sense and come to fruition. Also, go ahead and reach out to me if you have any confusion or any questions related to that. Do not forget, we are reading chapters 4 and 5 this week. We're watching and learning about 6 theories, and watching the videos related to them. Completing discussion board number 3, which is due on Friday, with our reply post due on Sunday, as well as completing critical review number 2 on Sunday. If you have any questions, like I said, let me know. I look forward to interacting with you, and I pray you all have a blessed week. I've really enjoyed going through a lot of your assignments and look forward to our future interactions. God bless.